Baseball is in my blood. It's my summer sport of choice, at least now it is. I learned early on in my marriage that baseball was my husband's avocation, because he could smell a baseball park blocks and blocks away, whether it was a minor league park or a major league park. It really didn't make any difference to him. On one of our very first vacations, we were in Cleveland. The team wasn't at home, but my husband went to the park and he found an opening under the bleachers. And guess what? We wound our way under the bleachers just so he could stand on home plate in the old Cleveland Indians park. And I was probably one of the very first people, at least a bride, whose major Christmas present, her first year marriage, was season's tickets to the Salem Pirates minor league team games. And folks, that spring and summer, we were at almost every game that those Class A Pirates played. But it was the last time I received those tickets, I promise you. So, this past week, as I sat preparing today's message, I was once again reminded of a story that I heard some time ago, but similar, not to me, but perhaps it's one played out in every aspect of life in some way. This is a story about a California Angels baseball prospect who, not so very long ago, retired from Class A baseball to follow a higher power. Grant Desmay was a young man destined to be a true all-star player. A young man who one day made a life-defining phone call to the A's general manager, Billy Beane. Life-defining, because this young man knew that when he finished that call, his baseball days were over. In an interview, Desmay said that a great peace came over him as he talked with his manager. For in that call, this young man shared with his manager that God was calling him to the priesthood and that he had been accepted at a Southern California Catholic seminary. No longer would he be facing pitchers on a mound, but he would be facing a 10-year journey to becoming a Roman Catholic priest. To be certain, God knew Desmay long before he was born, just as God knew Jeremiah, the protagonist in today's Old Testament lesson. Yes, God knew Jeremiah long before he was born. In the year 628 BC or thereabouts, God called on Jeremiah, a young man from a priestly family. And as the son of a priest, Jeremiah was also expected to enter the priesthood, to become a bridge between God and God's people, to teach the law and to guard the covenant between Israel and God, to offer incense and offerings on God's altars, and to sacrifice animals as acts of atonement for the sins of the people. Such a calling required ever so much accountability and an amazing amount of responsibility. But the older I get, the more I realize, the more I know that my plans and God's plans are not always the same plans. For God is a God of surprises. And Jeremiah learned that God had other plans for Jeremiah's life. Plans for Jeremiah to not be a priest, but for Jeremiah to be a prophet. And folks, there is a huge difference. For a prophet's life is far from being cushy. Why? Because nobody likes a prophet who tells it like it is. And Jeremiah knew that he was not going to be well liked. A priest serves. A prophet tells us something we don't particularly want to know. They tell us we're sinners. They tell us we're prostituting ourselves to a very popular culture. And they tell us that if we do not turn to God, that if we do not give God everything, then we're in for let's just say it's probably not going to be a pretty picture. This, my friends, was surely not the type of ministry that Jeremiah had in store for himself. I'm sure that he had never looked in a mirror and said, God, I want to be a prophet. I want to tell people this and this and this. I don't want a cushy life. I don't even care if I'm liked. Oh, come on. I don't think any young man would have said that. But God's response to Jeremiah were words to be remembered. God said to Jeremiah, in response to God calling him to be a prophet, Jeremiah, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you to be a prophet to the nations and kingdoms, to pluck up, to pull down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. This was God's plan for Jeremiah, not when he was 32 years old, but long before Jeremiah was born. What an awesome charge for a young man who would soon be ridiculed and humiliated, beaten and imprisoned, and thrown in a proverbial pit to die. And yet, as Jeremiah persisted in doing what God called him to do, he answered for himself and he answered for each of us 3 of life's most important questions. Who am I? Why am I here? And from whence cometh my help? Karen Burton Mays tells a sweet story about one of her children, a child who was small and had been misbehaving. And one day, this little one found himself at the end of a stern parental lecture. "What are we going to do?" asked the adult. and in self-resignation, the child just looked up and said, "Why don't we just throw me into the garbage?" Parents, you've heard such things, haven't you? Why don't we just throw me into the garbage? And that, says Ms. Mays, has become the signature statement for any time one of their family members is frustrated with himself. Just throw me into the garbage, I guess. And today, in the garbage is where all too many people in God's world see themselves. People who feel that they have no importance, their name is unknown, they assume they have no value, no potential, and no purpose in life. But then we ask, but who are we? Who are we in the eyes of God? The answer was clear for Jeremiah. The answer must be clear for us this morning. When God the Father looks down at us, He doesn't see an unknown person. God never sees garbage to just be tossed out. Rather, God sees an intimately known child of His, a child known to God. Think about it. You were known to God even before you were born. And as our United Methodist celebration of death and resurrection so beautifully says, before she was yours, she is mine. Before he was yours, he is mine. In other words, we are God's children before we are born. We are God's children in life. And we are God's children for all time and eternity. Death is not the end. And now that we know who we are, you and I are bound to ask, well, why are we here? Have you ever heard the phrase, he marches to the tune of a different drummer? I know without a doubt that my mom and dad thought that my sister marched to the tune of a different drummer. They tested every corpuscle in she tested every corpuscle in my parents' body before she was 21. And some of you have had children. You just stand there and go, ah, you know? Children who marched to the tune of a different drummer. And we, as God's children, who march to the tune of a different drummer. To be certain, Jeremiah was a nonconformist, but Jeremiah knew exactly why he was here. Jeremiah knew that God had set him apart to pluck up and to pull down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. In other words, Jeremiah knew that God had called him to be a prophet. Jeremiah knew that God had called him to be a prophet. Fortunately, perhaps unfortunately, God calls few to be prophets today. But this I do know, prophet or not, God calls each and every one of us to be nonconformist Christians. Christians set apart to do what needs to be done in God's world today. Christians willing to declare that the church is not just about us, but that the church is about God's world. Nonconformist Christians who refuse to ignore our responsibility to God and to all God's children. Nonconformist Christians who are willing to tell the world that the church is not about us. The church, God's church, is all about God. And from whence will we find the energy and the endurance to heed God's call? There is absolutely no question that just as God puts his words into Jeremiah's mouth, so God supplied Jeremiah with the power to do everything God commanded him to do. But the good news is that God never left Jeremiah alone. God said to Jeremiah, "Do not be afraid of the people. I am with you, and I will deliver you." In other words, God supplied Jeremiah with an identity. God gave him a job to do, and God then equipped Jeremiah to do the task which God had placed upon him. And this is the message for God's church today. When God calls God's church, when God calls God's people, God doesn't rely upon our ability alone to do God's work. Rather, God chooses unlikely people who will put their trust, their total trust in God to do God's work. Yes, my friends, God chooses you. God chooses me. God chooses God's people throughout the world. God chooses such friends to do God's work. And then God relies upon our obedience. But when we obey, and through God's grace, God allows us to accomplish far more than we ever dreamed possible. I pray this morning that you and I, like Jeremiah, will discover anew who we are, that the church today will rediscover what it means to be the church that God calls it to be. Yes, a church full of God's own children. I pray that we will discover why we are here and why the church exists. The church exists to serve God, to use the unique gifts God has given each of us, the gifts that God has given to the corporate church. On this day, I invite you to recommit yourself, to be part of a recommitment at this church, to be a part of our great United Methodist changing church, a church positioned to reach out to the world in a new and wondrous way. And I pray that all will discover anew that God will always provide the power, the grace, the love, and the Spirit to accomplish that which God has proposed for our lives. Oh, my friends, this is the good news of the gospel. This is the good news of the gospel as we look forward to the year 2017. Yes, this is the good news for Jeremiah, for you, for me, for all God's children, for God's church this morning. Thanks be to God, now and forever. And all of God's children say, Amen.